Welcome to the third episode of First Fuel, a podcast bringing you perspectives on the role of energy efficiency, energy management and demand response in the energy transition playing out here in Australia and around the world. I'm Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tennant Reed, Head of Climate, Energy and Environment Policy at Australian Industry Group. I think I can say that, Tennant, you are something of a wonks wonk, well known and well respected among energy and climate advocates here in Australia, as you, I think, have been driving much of our group's engagement in this space for over a decade now. Welcome, Tennant.
Good to be with you, Luke.
So, Tennant, I think it's fair to say that at this point we're both fairly grizzled veterans of a number of campaigns to encourage governments to invest more effort in energy efficiency and energy management policies. There's been some triumphs and some setbacks along the way, but our group's engagement on this topic has been pretty unwavering, I'd say. I'm interested to kick us off to understand why energy efficiency remains a strategic priority. We're operating in an incredibly and increasingly crowded energy policy space, and you've got many competing issues on your plate, as does your broader organisation when it comes to energy. So why does energy efficiency remain close to the top of the priority list for you and your members?
So you're right that there is a lot going on. There's always a lot going on. And I think the most important reason why we've been interested for so long in what more can be done on energy efficiency, energy productivity among our members, but also among the other sectors and the wider community is there's continuing cause for some pessimism about the price of energy and the threats to competitiveness from high energy costs looking into the future. We have seen a few periods of suppressed wholesale electricity prices, wholesale gas prices in the past decade, but there's always been that nagging concern, the cloud over the horizon, that prices were going to rise later. And today, as we sit in very dark economic circumstances, one of the silver linings for many businesses is that it looks like wholesale electricity prices will be low for a little while. It looks like wholesale gas prices will be lower than we thought was possible. But the chances are they're not going to stay low for as long as users would like, and being set up to prevent higher prices from turning into higher final costs is as good an idea today as it has been at any time in the past decade.
I guess that's right, and it's something that we've tried to express through some of our guides and engagement with business over the last couple of years. We've got the Navigating a Dynamic Energy Landscape series that we release every year, which is effectively a bit of a layman's outlook on what the energy and gas markets are doing, and then some guidance on what businesses can do across energy efficiency, energy management, renewables, demand response and procurement. And one of the points that we make is that investments in energy efficiency and energy management, and indeed sort of behind the meter generation and some of the other solutions that we profile in those reports, is that as much as anything else, while the price will go up and down, what we can be kind of confident of if we project forward is that there's going to be ongoing volatility in energy markets, and that from a risk management perspective, and investments in the things that you have some control over reduces your exposure to that volatility, which from a business perspective, I think, Tennant, stacks up if you're able to look beyond the next year or two. Energy efficiency and energy management is a prudent investment.
Absolutely.
So, we live in extraordinary times, Tennant, and perhaps even more extraordinary than we anticipated. We knew that this was going to be a big year on a range of fronts. We started with some cataclysmic bushfires, climate policy for a few moments rocketed to the top of the agenda. We also knew that, we thought we knew that this was going to be a year of a very significant Conference of Parties meeting under the UNFCCC, sort of a process that you've been pretty engaged with, and I know you've been travelling to the last few COPs over the previous couple of years. As it turns out, we're having an entirely different year. We're no longer talking about bushfires or climate change, and the COP's not even happening this year. The focus is wholly solely on two things, I suppose: the immediate health impacts of COVID-19, and then obviously the economic impacts that flow on from that. I know when you think about the impact of any sort of economic development on your industry, you sort of start with the broader sort of Australian and global impact, without you necessarily having to characterise or take the pulse of the entire global economy. How are you feeling sitting here as we record in mid-May, with still quite a lot of uncertainty around the economic outlook for this year and for the coming years, given where we are in the midst of dealing with this pandemic?
Look, I'm a generally pretty optimistic person, but I'm pretty worried. The Australian response so far has been, very strong. We are compared to most countries around the world, we are in a terrific position. But that is strictly, relatively speaking. The economic statistics that are starting to come out, they are all, slices in time. They are all imperfect metrics of what is going on, but they're very bad. In ordinary terms, we would say, that they are catastrophic. There may be millions more unemployed people in larger economies than we're experiencing, but the kind of surge in unemployment, the reduction in activity across many sectors, these are really, really concerning. And we are going to hopefully continue to be able to reduce restrictions and reactivate more parts of the economy in the months ahead, subject to that public health imperative. But say we do bring back most of the economy, it's not going to be all of the economy. And, reopening 90% of what is closed would be a much better place to be. But ordinarily, you would say an economy that had contracted by 10% was an unthinkable disaster area. So we've got, that it's not all going to come back, at least not right away. But then also we're looking at waves of impact. We have feedback from our members. So our group's members are businesses of all sizes across a lot of different sectors, but many of them in manufacturing. Their feedback to us is some of them, they have never been busier. If they're making hand sanitizer, if they're making protective equipment, some of them have a significant pipeline of pre-existing work for the next several months, and then they're not too certain what comes after that. The feedback is overwhelmingly that the challenges that they face are much more a lack of demand for their products and services rather than the restrictions limiting their ability to supply the demand that there is. So that demand side challenge is very big, and it's potentially self-sustaining. One of the things that we collectively, and this is a challenge for every government in Australia, need to keep our eye on is the risk that everybody's impulse is to do what's sensible given their own finances, their own circumstances. If they're facing a loss of income as an individual or as a company, you want to cut back on expenditure, defer investment, do things that are going to reduce the risk that you're overextended. But if everybody does that individually sensitive step, then the contraction in demand and investment across the economy can become self-reinforcing. And we have seen that before in Australia. It has been some time since we've experienced that cycle, but that was something that many countries in Europe dealt with over a very slow recovery from the global financial crisis. So the public policy picture is going to make all the difference here. But it's not just Australian public policy. It's not just the Australian economy. Of course, we're going to see a lot of impact from the choices that other countries make and the success that they have or don't have in managing their public health challenges. And clearly, there's some countries also doing very well, and there's some countries, big countries, that are not doing very well. And we are going to be caught up in the economic afterwash of that.
Indeed, and the countries not doing so well include some of our very major trading partners, of course. I suppose I'm interested to delve into that a little bit because I suppose as advocates we're always, cautious about, immediately running to the government and pulling that lever to say, well, you've got to solve this problem. That's not always the case that government is the right mechanism. But in the environment that you described, Tennant, where there is a very strong prospect that both domestic and global demand for products really does completely dry up for a period of time. What is the role of, say, a national government in Australia in pump priming the economy, in keeping the economy ticking over while we work our way through a crisis which has every prospect of being 12, 18, 24 months at the very least?
If not the return of the 1930s. So government does have a big role, and that's not to say that there's only one way to do things, and different governments are going to have different preferences on how they support the economy, and plenty of room for argument about the best ways to do that. But the overall picture is that the government the national government has considerable fiscal capacity, fiscal room to support the economy, whether that is through collecting less revenue or spending more. It does need to keep an eye on the long-term fiscal consequences of the decisions that are made now. And the accumulation of national debt is something that does need to be managed. It's also not, as my boss has said recently, it's not an immediate crisis in the way that the state of the economy is. So I think the role of government is to have a very expansionary fiscal stance. We should not be pursuing surpluses for some time to come, and that's lucky because we're not going to get them.
Don't aim for something that you can't achieve is my watchword, Tennant.
Absolutely. And pursuing one in, unless we and until we see broad-based recovery across the economy, pursuing one will deepen the pain. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the quality of spending or the quality of taxing. There's plenty of important conversations to have about reforms, building long-term productivity, strengthening our long-term prospects and not undermining them. But there is a big hole in the economy right now, and if we don't fill it, we will all feel that very intensely going forward. And nobody more intensely than those businesses that risk closure and those workers who risk not having a job for a long time. The early 90s recession, some of the people who entered the ranks of the unemployed in the early 90s never worked again. And the long-term unemployed number took a long time to shrink. So we do need to do what we can to prevent that increase and to help people bounce back as fast as they can. Existing policy, the JobKeeper and JobSeeker, are tremendously important, but we are going to have to hand over from those acute measures to steps that don't just sustain us through hibernation, but get us back into growth.
So we're going to spend some time a little bit later in our chat around the particular stimulus measures we should be contemplating. But before I do that, I'm interested to know, what's happening in particular subsections of your membership. You mentioned that, say, just hypothetically, if you're a food processor, you've probably been doing pretty well over the last couple of months, and demand's been pretty high. Is that fair to say? And I'm interested to know, relative to other parts of the manufacturing sector, where are the parts that are kind of in a strange sort of boom cycle? Which are the parts which are kind of just ticking over, and are there any that are actually doing it really tough?
So 2 months ago, overall, the manufacturing sector was in expansion. The level of activity was surging, and that was, it's now clear, pretty much driven by the rush of households to stock up before the crisis made that they feared difficult. Last month, we had the deepest the steepest contraction in manufacturing activity across Australia in the 28 years that we've been gathering that data, and to the lowest absolute level of activity since in manufacturing since the depths of the global financial crisis. So, again, it is a varied picture, but across the board, it's pretty bad. And there are points of expansion. There are businesses that are shifting their production into some of the goods that are now in higher demand than ever before, particularly cleaning products. But there is overall, there's a big reduction in activity. Many businesses have been, wherever possible, they have been standing workers down rather than severing the connection to the business. And the JobKeeper program, as more and more businesses have grappled with the details of that and eligibility and so on, that has been making a big difference. But the feedback that we have is that many businesses are having to look at how many people can they sustain, given the activity levels that they can foresee from their order books. And we're going to see those unemployment numbers and retrenchment numbers tick up, at best tick up over the next few months. And then potentially, when the existing order books are, that has all flowed through, we could, in the absence of preventive steps from industry, from governments at all levels, we could see a wave of contractions and closures and firings in 6 months, 12 months. There's going to be a lot to happen between now and then that could change that picture, but they're very, very big risks that we face.
So let's turn to the recovery. And last week, your CEO, Eunice Willix, said that the recovery effort and the transition to net zero should be linked. I think he said that at a Clean Energy Council summit. And Tennant, I suppose, just to kind of test the thinking a little bit, to play devil's advocate, I'm sure there are commentators out there that would regard that linkage as superfluous. They would say that government's job at the moment is pretty straightforward. They should have a laser-like focus on the return to growth and job creation, and other, albeit worthy but less immediate concerns like the transition to net zero perhaps should be put on the back burner for the minute while we deal with this immediate crisis. So, Tennant, from I suppose from the AI Group's perspective, why would you say that's a wrong-headed view?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that, as my boss said at the summits last week, that energy transition and economic recovery are overlapping subjects. They're not the same subject. There are absolutely elements of a clean energy transition that are, for all their long-term importance, they're not going to make a difference to the recovery now. They're on a different timescale. There are plenty of ideas for an economic recovery that could contribute there that don't have anything much to do with a clean energy transition. But what we've concluded, and we've spoken to a great many companies and organisations in forming that view, is that there is a very productive overlap between those two subjects. We know that to have an economy that is strong and a society that is strong over the long term, we need a successful response to climate change to minimise and contribute to a global solution that minimises the amount of it we've got to deal with and deals with what we can't avoid. And we know that we need a successful economic transition to a world that is net zero emissions. There's opportunity in that transition, there's risks to manage in that transition, and getting there requires ultimately a great deal of investment. Some of that investment is suitable to bring forward to a period where otherwise we're looking at a steep shortfall in investment and in consumption. So there's a lot of useful stuff that we think can be done that will give us a double benefit, will drive activity, speed the recovery, and then put us on a better footing on the other side, because we don't want to do just anything. Yep. We want to do things that we won't regret when it comes time to pay for all of the economic support spending that we're doing now. And that's whether it's out and out spending or tax reductions, foregone revenue, ultimately it's going to add to a store of debt, and we want that debt to have been worth incurring. Having an economic recovery is an enormous priority, but getting the most benefit out of that spending is going to be very important.
I guess that's right. So the multiple benefits that accrue from investments in, I guess, a clean recovery, a clean energy transition, sort of help deal with the acute issues as well as some of the long-term rolling issues that we have in terms of that economic restructuring that we know needs to come and needs to take place. And by what an analogy just occurred to me, Tennant, as we've been talking to companies large and small over the last few years around the acute issues caused by rising energy prices. And certainly as they managed those risks and that volatility, some were motivated to start thinking more deeply about the opportunities in that space by the price signal, but it was an added bonus that the same investments they were making to reduce their exposure in that area also started the process of helping them dealing with their carbon load. And so they were dealing with an acute issue while reducing their exposure to a longer term risk, and kind of makes sense when you look at it from that perspective. But it is, I think, challenging, whether you're in business or in government, and you're dealing with an acute crisis, to hold the immediate concern in your head at the same time as you're thinking about, the various permutations or scenarios that could evolve from the particular solutions you have to that immediate crisis. We are asking a lot of our governments right now, and that's without even getting to saving all our lives.
No, it's absolutely true, but I think we are seeing just how enormous the consequences are of risks that ordinarily feel pretty remote, that we've got advice, over the long term are certain to happen. But in the case of a pandemic, you never know which year will be the unlucky year. In the case of climate change, many of those impacts are very slow to develop. But if you don't do something about them, treatment is imperfect and extremely costly. Prevention is a great thing to get on top of if you've got the chance. We do have enormous immediate needs to meet, but we've also got to ensure we're not in a similar or worse position when the next crisis falls upon us.
All right, Tennant. So you've convinced me, but I'm sure you appreciate that I'm something of a pushover on this topic. So, I'd say that the rhetoric around a clean recovery is gathering some momentum. Certainly, it seems to be getting a lot of traction in Europe. Here in Australia, it's being touted in some quarters and is gaining less traction in others. So, for advocates that are thinking through how they can ensure that stimulus measures go in this direction and need to build a consensus across the political divide, they don't need to convince everyone, but they need to convince enough people that it's palatable for governments at the state and federal level. What would your advice be? Noting again that you've been around the block a few times and the task of building that coalition or framing an argument that wins the day, something you turn your mind to fairly regularly.
So I think looking for options. I mean, the single most important thing is the idea, is the option, is it sufficiently concrete and actionable to be useful? Everybody can produce a topic sentence of things that would be nice. Are they something that there's actually some substance to? And if not, how do you go off and develop that? Talk to people who have experience with the industry sector or the form of technology or the kind of policy designs that may be useful. Like specific, concrete, actionable stuff is gold in these times. I was a very, very tiny cog in the response to the global financial crisis within the Australian government at that time. And you would be surprised, I certainly was surprised, at how hard it was to get actually decision-ready ideas out of everybody and anybody. There were state governments that were on the ball. There were state governments that I don't know, but they were a few stadiums over from where the ball was being passed, and governments can't make a decision in your favour until there's something there that is ready to decide on. So, that's the first thing. The second thing is that looking for consensus with other people. I think the conversation about clean energy or energy transition, it's full of people who seem to hate other people's technology more than they have any other thoughts.
No, perish the thought.
as fragmented and backbiting as can be, and people get very head up on absolutes. The solution's got to be all my thing, and anything else is a disaster or a betrayal or whatever. That's not an approach that seems to lead to diverse coalitions of people. When you've got a group of people who all think and talk and look the same, pushing something, that is not nearly as persuasive to governments who need to represent the whole community and have concern for the interests and the views of the whole of the community, now more than ever, to get input from a monoculture is not that persuasive. So I've found in the discussions around this issue of a pro-transition, pro-recovery policy suite, the thing that gets the most people in the most different quarters saying, yeah, that would be a good idea, is a push around energy management, energy efficiency, energy usage across the economy, because it's something that seems relevant to, and it is relevant to nearly everybody. There are some people who are, and some businesses who are so on top of that, there's not much more that would be worth doing, even with public support. There's an awful lot who are not there for one reason or another. And it's something that would provide both potentially a lot of diverse activity across different parts of the country and pieces of the economy, while providing a very long tail of benefits for our energy system, for energy users, for making a successful transition to a lower emissions economy, and making a successful transition to the prices, the price changes that have been taking shape in power and gas over a long period. So like that has a lot of potential. Whereas I see some people putting their eggs all in the basket of 100% renewables or whatever else. It's pretty clear we're going to have a lot of renewables in the future energy system. It's less clear that it's whether it's going to be 70%, 90%, 98.5%, 100 200%. That's a bit less certain, and insisting that must be the answer makes it, I think, harder to build consensus. So that's not going to be the case with every technology. Some of them, their problem is not entrenched views. It's that there's just not much of a view yet about them at all. And I think we do need to distinguish, as part of that concrete decision-ready options focus, we need to distinguish between things that really are ready to go now and things that, while they may ultimately be where our economy needs to go, aren't something that you can do anything on in the next couple of years at a scale that is relevant to recovery. Still might be very worthwhile doing investments for the future that move technologies to a scalable point. But to move the dial on recovery, you need things that are in the region of $50, $100 million plus, and lots of those, because this is a $2 trillion economy now. It takes a lot to move the needle.
It's a really good point, and one that Brian Motherway, who leads up energy efficiency at the International Energy Agency, made last week. And he, like you, Tennant, was in government at the GFC, and he's now in the position of providing advice to governments around, particularly how energy efficiency can play a role in recovery efforts. And the point he made was that you need to have a really laser-like focus on the subset of the things that can have a benefit that, to use that cliche, Tennant, shovel ready, that can get going very quickly, that drive significant economic activity, and particularly a jobs multiplier. So, sole traders, SMEs, trades, parts of the economy that are really going to be hurting at this time. If it has a benefit for them, then it's going to go up the priority list. And of course, that long-term productivity dividend, if something can be done quickly, have a jobs multiplier, and is going to improve the long-term productivity of the economy overall, then it's at least going to be on the list or deserves to be on the list. And I'm happy to say that for energy efficiency and energy management, it meets many of those criteria at a high level. As you said, the EEC and AI Group has been one part of a much broader coalition that's been discussing the areas that we can all agree on, and I was delighted that that appears to be one that is emerging. But you've got to be clear-headed about this, and energy efficiency is a very broad topic, and not everything on the list of wonderful things we should be doing on the demand side meets the criteria for stimulus. And so being able to be very straightforward with government around the bits of the list that are appropriate in the stimulus context, and the bits of the list which we need to get to, but perhaps it's not what we focus on the next 6 months, builds credibility, right? And allows you to have a really productive conversation rather than just going in with a laundry list of all the stuff that you've always wanted to do. And maybe while there's billions of dollars being splashed around, you could possibly get it across the line while no one's looking.
Now more than ever, people should listen to all my priorities and preferences.
And the other thing to be mindful of, obviously, is that every part of the economy, every industry body, every professional association has such a list, right? And so this is again, the government I think is mostly still focused on the health implications of COVID, to the degree possible, turning their attention to the longer term economic implications, that having sort of stepped in, as you say, and dealt with some of the immediate ones with programs like JobKeeper. But there are a lot of ideas out there, so working out how to frame something up that cuts through is a challenge for all of us that have an interest in making sure that the stimulus spending that is taking place does have a double or triple dividend.
I would add there, though, that I think everybody should spend more time collating their wish lists, because that I don't think that there's actually as many well-developed wish lists on hand as we really need when these things arise. Again, there's a lot of topic sentences. There's not a lot of there's not as many shovel-ready actionable agendas in bottom drawers ready to be unrolled and dusted off and put into a proposal to government as would actually be useful when these things arise. There are a lot of work to do, and it has been 10 years between, or 11 years between crises of a scale that seem to require that. It can feel like it's not effort well spent, but when the bolt from the blue arrives, it is very handy to have a really good wish list on hand.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
Yeah. And governments, they don't want to be bombarded with rubbish, and they, having once upon a time had to draft letters back to people who were proposing special government stimulus assistance to fund a troubled business project that they had that offered no wider benefits to anybody else whatsoever. That's time that they would rather spend on other things. But when they really need good ideas, they will be grateful for good lists.
Mm-hmm. So, Tennant, as you know, every episode of First Fuel is broadcast live via a webinar, and we have had some participants dropping questions into the chat.
Fire away.
Well, absolutely. So there's one here which I think is a natural segue from what we've been talking about, which is what is on AI Group's wish list. What are the things that for your members tick the boxes in terms of supporting them through this economic crisis, particularly if they, also speak to the agenda that you and your boss have been advocating for in terms of a clean recovery.
Sure. Well, so AI Group has got a very broad focus across the organisation. We are active in workplace relations, in education and training, in tax policy, innovation, the future of manufacturing, trade. There's a lot going on across those things, and we hope in a few weeks' time to have a set of policy papers across all those areas that lay out some priorities. I'm not going to issue spoilers for all of those things, but in the energy and climate space in particular, there's some opportunities for recovery, and there's some things that we need to do to be on a stronger foundation going forward. On the recovery front, I've already talked a bit about energy efficiency, energy management, but it does need to be emphasised that if we can agree on some mechanisms for encouraging broad-based upgrades to Australia's built environment, whether that is housing, commercial buildings, industrial sites, government buildings, that creates a pipeline of activity for manufacturers of building products, manufacturers of the equipment that goes into more energy efficient and better managed on an energy front buildings. And the larger and longer term and more definite that pipeline is, the greater the ability of businesses to invest and recruit to expand their local ability to supply that expected demand. So that's something that that expansion of supplying capacity is going to be extremely important to happen somewhere, because there are bits of the economy that have employed a lot of people, many parts of services and tourism, where they are going to take a long time to recover, if they recover fully at all. And a lot of people are going to be all too available to be redeployed to other activities in the economy if that demand is there. Other things that could be very useful beyond energy efficiency, energy management, there is real potential in hydrogen. Now, we need to both be realistic in the near term and be cognizant of the very enormous opportunities in the long term. Hydrogen production through electrolysis is currently pretty expensive. Among the things needed to get those costs down is globally to install a lot of electrolyzers to get that technology down the cost curve through learning and through scale, similar to what we have seen in solar PV and are seeing in batteries. And so there's a big need for the long term to just build a bunch of electrolyzers. And it would be to Australia's great long-term advantage for those costs to come down, because we have as great a potential as anyone, and more than nearly everyone, to be huge in a world where hydrogen is big, whether that is through exporting hydrogen or through using it and using the clean energy that produces it to fuel green metals industries, green steel, aluminium, to fuel our chemicals sector, to expand manufacturing and industry. Now, that most ambitious vision is not going to be realised in the next 18 months to 2 years, however long this acute phase of crisis lasts. But we can potentially do some pretty sizable early investments into production and maybe some aspects of the use of hydrogen that will be ultimately, the seed for an economic hedge in a future where demand for some of our other exports may be declining.
So I suppose from that perspective, if you've got the view that hydrogen has that part to play in Australia's future economy, that phrase that gets thrown around as it's kind of the next phase of our role as a global energy superpower. This crisis is coming at a moment when we probably have enough information and enough confidence to begin making those investments and deciding that that's a reasonable bet to make over the next couple of years. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, there's many things that you can do in an engineering sense with hydrogen, uh, particularly for solving some of the harder to decarbonise activities across the economy. There are competing solutions for those things. You can do a lot with biomass, biofuels, biochar. You can use carbon capture and utilisation or storage for some activities. You can use new materials. You can shift modes. So we're all discovering just how much transport can be substituted with digital. But there are limits to many of those alternative solutions. There's only so much biomass that we can sustainably produce, for instance. And so the doubt that we have about hydrogen in the long term, in a world that is moving, not yet nearly fast enough to achieve our collective climate goals, but moving towards deep emissions reductions, hydrogen is somewhere between very large and colossally, stupendously gigantic. And so there's plenty of room in that range of potential for people to lose their shirts on big bets on hydrogen that are a bit too early or a bit too large. But there's a very prudent case for Australia to make some early investments and then keep reviewing and calibrating and building on those investments as fast as seems sensible in the light of the development of that global market and the domestic potential to use it. Now, in the near term, I would say that upgrading Australia's built environment has got more zeros after it in terms of the amount of money it can usefully absorb, but hydrogen should not be overlooked.
Yeah, that's super interesting that you put hydrogen in the context of stimulus, because that's not where it was categorized in my brain. So the fact that there are certain investments that can be made that could be argued for in the context of stimulus is interesting. What about other technologies beyond hydrogen for the industrial sector that perhaps are underutilized or are less common that could be rolled out quickly and done in a way that utilised existing supply chains, existing skills? Are there other things on the list that immediately jump to mind?
So there are upgrades to our transport system that could be very useful for parts of manufacturing. So electrification of transport is clearly going to be quite large. There's some forms of transport where liquid fuels seem like they're going to be the most useful option for a long time to come, if not always. There's others where battery electric or hydrogen electric in some contexts looks like it will be the dominant solution. So there are industry contexts where upgrading to those new solutions makes sense. Hydrogen forklifts are becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Electric heavy vehicles and are relevant in some contexts, in others it is hydrogen. But electrification of the light vehicle fleet is something that again could offer a lot of potential work for bits of the economy that support upgrades to electrical systems and the built environment. Given that electric vehicles are a vanishingly small part of the current car market, they're more substantial in other markets elsewhere. The number of charges that we need right now in the next couple of years is not nearly as large as the number that we will need in the years ahead. And so upgrades that provision parking lots in major public places, apartment buildings, very large workplaces, shopping complexes, service stations and major transit routes, provisioning those locations for the future installation of chargers as and when the demand supports that, could be a very useful investment to make now, and one that would get quite a lot of activity going. You do find some differences of view between people who think that it is easiest and most convenient for drivers to do their charging at home and do upgrades based around residences, versus people who think that the cheapest power is going to be in the middle of the day, and it will make sense to have charging take place at workplaces and parking locations for commuters. Frankly, at this time, I'm not sure that we should make a choice between those two. Let's provision the lot, or have a go at quite a bit of it and see what pans out going ahead. There's much less at risk when you're just upgrading the wiring.
Well, look, and the one thing that always occurs to me when the topic of EVs comes up is a very interesting report that came out from the Rocky Mountain Institute, I believe it was in 2018, which linked the rollout of EV chargers with the opportunity to do what you pointed to a couple of minutes ago and upgrade the built environment, upgrade building stock, reduce the load of buildings on the grid while you add the load from EVs. And it turned, that piece of analysis suggested that a lot of the network augmentation that is being contemplated to pick up some of that EV load could be less necessary if you linked it to a significant upgrade program. That's kind of sector linking and thinking about the interrelationships between the built environment, the transport system. You pointed to the flow-on effects for the supply chain. If we had a major upgrade program to the built environment for the manufacturing sector, that could be crucial to provide manufacturers with increased demand for existing and new products associated with a campaign to renovate Australia and increase the quality of our building stock. That kind of holistic thinking it means that we are starting to get some of those double and triple dividends. I appreciate it's challenging to think about all those interactions in a crisis, but to the degree possible, it's something that we should be alive to, Tennant.
I'll add one more thing to that list, which is within the category of energy upgrades, electrification of industrial heat processes. So a lot of that currently depends on gas, some of it on coal. Some of that is substitutable with electrical processes, and there's been some good work done by ARENA recently on the opportunities for process heat from electrical sources and greater efficiency of existing gas sources. And part of the context for this is that while we're seeing spot gas prices absolutely plunge to levels that felt like they would never return, the contract prices haven't fallen as far, and there's no reason to think that gas prices won't return at some point post this crisis to roughly the level that we expected them to be at pre-crisis. There's also the risk, because existing supply from conventional gas resources in the Bass Strait is coming off fast, and the global oil and gas sector is slashing its exploration and development budgets to the bone, given what's happening to global oil prices. There is a risk that we are going to be back to an extremely tight gas market in 3 or 4 years' time, potentially one that is short of demand. And so it makes very good sense for multiple reasons to transition some demand out of gas and into electricity. That's not going to be the case for everything. I think low temperature applications are still much more practical and viable than high temperature heat from electrical sources for many applications. And we do want to be cautious about to ensure that the grid infrastructure is going to be adequate, and that any augmentations are worthwhile on net, not just for individual users. But there's some important potential there, especially for seasonally flat loads, including quite a bit of industrial and commercial use.
Mm-hmm. And I wholeheartedly agree. It's one of the things on our list as well. And it strikes me that that sort of program is well suited to the kind of bulk rollout, identifying subsectors of the manufacturing sector that could benefit from that technology, a relatively straightforward replacement process, and allowing government to also get some economies of scale and associated benefits in terms of skills development so that people get their head around actually installing this stuff that perhaps haven't been directly engaged in the industry previously, and supply chain development as well. So potentially a really fruitful area for exploration. We have one more question from the chat, Tennant, and it's around given the consensus that you've noted among a whole range of groups around energy efficiency and energy management, and given the breadth of that kind of umbrella term, how should government go about focusing, and ensuring that it's investing in areas that are additional, that it's targeting its investments appropriately, and driving activity in terms of the jobs multiplier or the economic activity, but also in terms of emissions reduction in areas that wouldn't just happen anyway?
So I'm not sure that government should get actually too fussed about additionality. You don't, as a government, want to see people just take the money and do less of something else, and not on net add to spending. But additionality is, at the best of times, a very hard thing to really definitively establish. I think people involved in the Emissions Reduction Fund, Climate Solutions Fund, have post-traumatic stress disorder with additionality discussions. And what you cannot afford is to have a process be so difficult to engage with that nothing happens. It is very critical in the whole point of stimulus and recovery programs and policies is to push money out the door. That said, yes, you do need to have a look at not just at what might be displaced or whether it would have happened anyway, but is it going to happen in a safe manner? Is it going to happen in a manner that actually delivers the benefits sought? And so ensuring that money is going into areas where there is decent standards that apply, professional regulation, that regulators and industry departments and relevant officials are available to provide support and advice. Those things are very important, as is taking the time to design programs and supports appropriately. It is this is potentially a crisis, an economic crisis that is going to last for a considerable while. We will be extremely lucky if we have a V-shaped recovery from all of this. And so, given that we're looking most likely at multiple waves of economic impact, looking at multiple waves of economic response makes a lot of sense. So nothing is such a good idea it can't be stuffed up in practice, and that goes especially for complex and deeper upgrades to the built environment. But the potential is large enough to make it worth investing the time and the headspace to get those things right.
It's a great note to end on, Tennant. I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate you putting aside an hour to chat this afternoon on what I know is a very busy day, and also want to acknowledge the long-standing partnership between AI Group and the Energy Efficiency Council. We value the partnership. We value your council. We value the ability to come and share a harebrained idea with you and tell us why it will or won't work. And so we're looking forward to future collaborations and future interactions, and all the very best to you and your family as we all navigate this crisis.
And the same to you.
So that wraps up our third episode of First Fuel. If you have comments, you can find both Tennant and I on Twitter. My handle is @Luke Menzel, all one word, and Tennant's is @Tennant Reed. And I can recommend his account, both for the quality of its energy policy analysis and, of course, the recent and regular posts you've been putting up, Tennant, on easy-to-make recipes that are perfect for your COVID-19 isolation. If Twitter is not your thing, you can email the team. The address is firstfuel@eec.org.au. Every episode of First Fuel is broadcast as it's recorded, so you can jump on Zoom, listen in live, and even contribute questions in the chat. For a full listing of upcoming recording times, visit eec.org.au/podcasts. But for now, it's goodbye from us, and we'll catch you soon.